Good morning and welcome to the 36th meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for 2019. I have apologies from committee member Dean Lockhart, and the first item on the agenda is a decision by the committee to take items 3 and 4 in private. Are we agreed? Agreed. Thank you. We now turn to our energy inquiry, and today we have members of the Royal Society of Edinburgh's Energy Inquiry Committee, so I'd like to welcome them. First of all, we have Professor Gareth Harrison, the Deputy Chair, Professor Rebecca Lunn, Professor John Underhill and Professor Gavin Little. So welcome to all four of you. And I understand, Professor Lunn, you have an opening statement which you could perhaps provide us with now. Thank you.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting us. So this energy inquiry from the Royal Society of Edinburgh took around a year to produce, slightly over, I think, and we took evidence from quite a wide range of people. So we had public meetings as well as meetings with industry and indeed Scottish Government. So I'm just going to give a very brief summary of the findings, and I want to start by just reminding you of the scale of the problem, realistically. So if we start with the carbon targets, Scottish Government has committed to reduce carbon emissions by 42% by 2020 and by 80% by 2050. And probably the most famous target of all now, net zero carbon by 2045. And this report is partly around meeting energy needs, but it's very much in mind of that target and how the challenges as we move forward in trying to meet that target. So if we take a look at the data at the moment, 78% of Scottish energy consumption is actually in transport and heat. So everybody, when you talk about energy, mostly people think about electricity. But if you look at the 2017 Scottish Government data, 78% is in transport and heat. And in order to address that for carbon targets, as you're well aware, there is a move towards electrification, both of cars and of heating. So if we look at electricity for a minute, renewable generation has steadily increased as a percentage of electricity consumption, and Scotland is, pretty ahead of the game in renewable electricity generation. And more than 60% of its generation is now in renewables. If we look at low carbon generation, that's much higher because of the 2 nuclear power stations in Scotland. So around 80% of the generating capacity is low carbon in Scotland. But those stations are due to go offline, the nuclear stations. If we look at energy as a whole, though, which is what we're interested in for the net zero carbon target realistically, and also in order to provide Scotland with its energy, only 17.8% of Scottish energy consumption is actually provided by renewables. And that's the Scottish Government data. So around 80% of consumption remains fossil fuel based. So that is a very, very large percentage of energy that needs to be replaced. If you look at consumption, that needs to be replaced with alternatives, or the carbon needs to be captured. If we look at the whole of the UK, as this is not a devolved issue, much of it, 25% of consumption is what you would deem to be low carbon. So 25% of current UK consumption is either nuclear or renewables. So you're looking at a really significant challenge to turn that into something else. So the current plans, if you look at the UK, are to replace the current nuclear fleet and possibly to grow it in capacity, but that's proving challenging. And actually in Scotland, we're likely to lose low carbon generation because the nuclear fleet is going offline. So what we're faced with, I think, is a situation where you need to double, maybe treble electricity production if you electrify everything, and we don't go to keeping gas as part of our heating or transport system from fossil fuels. So you're looking at a very significant increase in electricity generation set against a backdrop where at the moment we have 80% of fossil fuels in our heating. So we have to very substantially increase production if that's the way we go. So I guess there are no easy, one of the things that came out of this is that there are no really easy answers to this problem. There are some possibilities. So in the report, we go through each of the different technologies and we look at whether they are costly, whether they are low carbon, whether they would require CCS, etc. And also some of the timelines, because some of them are still in a kind of research or at least development stage. So in terms of things that can be done, certainly we can reduce demand, and that part of that will be around making more energy efficient infrastructure and housing, but also maybe things like smart grids to reduce the amount of use the electricity we have more efficiently. Increasing our energy storage would also allow us to use energy more efficiently, but none of it is going to generate enough to meet, anywhere near enough to meet the gap that we're going to have. So other options, I think there's been a lot of discussion around hydrogen, so switch our natural gas network to hydrogen. That's fine, and it's certainly something that is discussed here, but it does require CCS to work, so carbon capture and storage at source. At the moment, the only way of producing a sufficient amount of hydrogen in a reasonably energy efficient manner, in a low-cost manner, is to crack methane. If you crack methane, you create carbon dioxide, which means that you would need to store CCS at source and then pump hydrogen around the gas network, which is a technological challenge in itself for converting things. Also requires domestic boilers and some industry infrastructure to be replaced if that's the way it went. Another option is nuclear. I appreciate that the Scottish Government has said no to nuclear at the moment, but that's on current technologies, so future nuclear technologies may also be an option. But those are probably, and then also clearly increasing renewables, and two of the key technologies that we look at in here are offshore wind as an opportunity, and also geothermal and ground source heat, and the idea of putting in district heating networks, all of which will to some extent reduce district heating, reduce demand. But again, we would have to have really significant, multiple times renewable capacity increase to meet current needs with purely renewables, which I think at the moment is not feasible. So in terms of key recommendations for the report, I think the key recommendations revolved largely around the fact that we didn't feel it was our place to make recommendations in terms of exactly what technologies Scottish Government should invest in, because there are multiple routes, and undoubtedly it's going to require a kind of basket of options, and there is really significant challenge ahead. So the key recommendation really was to set up an expert advisory commission that covers all aspects of energy and establish that under statute, and that should include the policy side of it, the economic side of it, as well as the technological side, because if you look at major infrastructure projects, not bringing the public with you is often one of the main things that holds projects up or even stops them completely, if you look at some of the nuclear problems in the UK, and finance as well is an issue for major projects. So it should include all aspects, including the problems of non-devolved energy. We also, in terms of, I'm not going to go through them all, but an issue with not producing more is that we continue to consume energy at the rate we consume it at the moment, or worse, and that would leave Scotland with extremely poor energy security, which makes us very vulnerable as a nation, and also geopolitically leaves us in a poor position. It's hard to apply moral pressure to states if you're relying on them for energy production. So one of the key recommendations was also a clearly articulated position on what security of supply Scotland should be aiming for in the future that it might feel comfortable with. There's a clear need to improve storage options, because that can help and that's an easy win, that can help us to use energy more efficiently and to use it more smartly. And reducing demand should be a priority. It's the most obvious thing to do, but it's not an easy thing to do. That will require investment, and it needs to happen in industry as well as, so using things like waste heat as well as in buildings and infrastructure. There's a clear requirement for R&D investment. There really are no straightforward technological solutions to this, so it's going to require R&D to meet this by 2045. And we need a skilled workforce as well to go along with that, so there'll need to be an investment in skills. And then finally, there needs to be communication in all levels across government. One of the things that we found when we went to talk, not to Scottish Government actually, but to UK Government, is that you talk to different departments, and transport are not aware of energy, and so there's no sort of joined up thinking across the piece in departments is a difficult thing to achieve. But if we're going to meet challenges as large as this, it's necessary to think about it in all of the decisions that are made. So I think that is a summary of our findings, and we're happy to take questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Lunn, for that opening statement. That's very helpful to set the framework for us today and give us some of the context. If I understood correctly, I mean, there's quite a number of issues in there that you referred to, but there's, I suppose I would think initially of three issues. One is the question of the production source of energy, so whether it's renewable or environmentally friendly, as it were. The second is the efficiency of the provision of that to private or public or indeed business and industry. And then the third is a question of consumption of energy and whether or not we can reduce the consumption of energy. Because if there's demand there, then usually people are prepared to produce things. I'm just wondering, how important is the consumption issue? Because I think it's probably the same with most things in life. People are quite willing to say that they want to see a reduction in the consumption of energy, and they want to see, you know, environmentally friendly approaches taken to energy. But what is the scale of the issue in terms of public consumption of energy and the increase in that in Scotland, in terms of the actual willingness to reduce? And perhaps that's something that applies to all of us, but how much would you say that's important in this whole scheme of things? I'm happy for any of you to sort of comment on that.
I think it's extremely important, not least because if we electrify vehicles, you're looking at probably doubling the need for production of electricity, which is the direction we're heading in. And I think it's not at all obvious that the market can cope with following that without gas-fired power. And that will not help us meet our carbon target unless we invest in CCS. So if we import energy, it's hard to see how we will import low-carbon energy, particularly since Europe is trying, even if we put interconnectors in, particularly since Europe is trying to hit the same set of targets as us and is also gas-reliant. So it's, in the end, the default, if we don't want blackouts, will be to import carbon-based energy, and then we have an issue with the net zero carbon. So I think the more we can reduce demand, the more doable producing low-carbon electricity will be. But I think the idea that that technologically we can just, that production will just happen because we wish to consume it is not realistic.
Do any others have a comment on the issue of demand? So if we have electric vehicles and everyone really likes them, they may start driving even more and therefore increase the energy requirements. I don't know. But what can be done around that?
Yes, I think this is a very important point, because the process that we've had to date in the energy sector and in relation to the low carbon transition has been primarily a sort of top-down technocratic approach. What we're moving to now, as we start to address the issues of heat and transport, will involve much greater cultural dimension and social dimension. And so I think that we do need to reflect on how this is addressed as a society, and I think there's much more scope and much more necessity, in fact, for political involvement in this process, because it is an inherently political process. And in that context, that was one of the issues which lay behind the recommendation for a statutory commission, because there's a need to move beyond merely focusing on technocratic and engineering style solutions to issues, and to start thinking about how we organise ourselves as a society in order to address these cultural shifts that are undoubtedly going to have to occur.
And I think your report, you did look at a process of public engagement and engagement of those involved in the energy industry and so forth. And in addition, of course, you have members who also have expertise in these areas. And was the thinking behind that to try and start that process or start that conversation? Or to encourage it?
I think that we were very much in listening mode in those different meetings. I took part in a number of them, and we were really, as the Royal Society of Edinburgh, we were really interested in finding out how people felt and what they thought, rather than trying to start a process of managing that.
Sorry, Professor Lund, you wanted to come back on that?
But I was just going to say that what we do discuss is the idea of having a more deliberative public consultation as part of some future commission, and there is no reason why you couldn't have members of the public on that commission either. So there is, without doubt, a need to bring the public in. So.
All right. Professor Harrison, and then we'll come to a question from Jamie Halker-Johnson.
I've switched
Sorry,
off,
just if you leave any of the buttons in the sound
okay.
desk, we'll switch your microphone on when you come in to speak.
That's okay. I mean, it's important that you don't lose sight of the fact that a lot of the solutions, actually certainly for reducing demand, are already here. So, I mean, one of the biggest issues is heating, and actually the vast majority of buildings in Scotland are abysmally insulated. And one of the challenges with that actually is, for most people actually, that it saves them money to do it, but the numbers are not particularly high in terms of what they would save. Now part of that is an undervaluing of energy, but also part of that is a factor that it's a pain in the neck to have your houses insulated, but it does need to be done. But one of the places that you can start with that is actually with the new builds, and actually making sure that they are properly insulated. You have proper levels of proper standards, and that they are enforced, and that's something that I think we're not really doing properly.
But I think the up-to-date standards on insulation that in Scotland for the new builds are quite advanced compared to what they were, say, 10 years ago. Is that not fair?
Undoubtedly they are, and they're certainly higher than in England, but they do need to be. But they're still quite low compared to Scandinavian standards. So, you know, one of the you've got a fairly similar climate here to southern, you know, sort of certainly Denmark and southern Sweden, and their heating bills are relatively low compared to ours.
And you mentioned enforcement. What is the problem with enforcement?
Well, enforcement really is through larger building companies. I believe are able to self-cert on some of their building standards, and you simply don't have enough building standards people within the councils. So if you're trying to put an extension on in Edinburgh at the moment, your wait is not for planning, your wait is 6 to 9 months for the council to find somebody who can actually look at your building, the building regulations. So there are issues there about capacity in terms of that. And if you really want to be serious about this, you need to make sure that the bodies that are charged with doing that are able to do it.
Right. Jamie Halker-Johnson.
If I could ask you two points. One, just on what you just said there. I represent the Highlands and Islands, Northern Isles, Orkney and Shetland, with high levels of fuel poverty, and also places that it can get pretty cold pretty quickly. Even within those communities, our communities up there, the organisations that are offering things like free insulation, efforts to make houses warmer, struggle to find people in some cases to do that, or to get that message across. Why do you think that is? And is part of it perhaps that there are too many different organisations offering that information, so it's almost, there's not one concerted effort?
I think there's a notable lack of skills or insufficient number of skilled people to do the work, and an insufficient. So there have been I can't comment on Scotland. I know in the rest of the UK there have been a number of examples where work has been extremely poorly done. And then there have been problems with the houses themselves afterwards in new build, where they're damp because there's no proper ventilation. It's just been badly done. So, and as I know, there's been a lot of issues around that, which again is around training and regulation, realistically, of a workforce. But I think it's not just that when you're putting up new build, to be perfectly honest. You know, there's no, if you look at Scandinavia, for example, district heating networks are standard in modern estates. That would save a significant amount of energy. So there are houses could be built to generate locally. So, you know, we need to be, when we're developing infrastructure, we should be thinking about making it as energy neutral as possible. So to generate as well as to reduce its demand.
Okay. Can I answer that actually along those same lines? I think the largest user of electricity in Scotland is Scottish Water. I think that's right. So is part of that making, when we're building new properties that we're reducing the requirements for things like you know, water usage to be, I mean, at the moment all water is produced at the same standards, so whether we drink it or we, you know, wash our car with it, is there a real role for that to help particularly companies or those organisations reduce their
Yeah, there is. It's grey water is what you're referring to, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah. So grey water is it's quite a small percentage of the water that you use in your house actually is required to be drinking water quality. It's less than 10%. I can't remember what it is, but it's small. So, and yet we use drinking water quality water for everything, and there's quite a high energy cost in purifying that water. So, and also then in treating everything afterwards. So there is, so we could easily develop housing so that you had two networks, yes, so that you can use the water from your washing machine to flush your toilet and all the rest of it, and from your roof, so you can use grey water for almost everything other than the drinking component of what you do. So
is that being taken seriously enough as an issue at the moment, do you think?
Not at the moment, no. Well, one thing I would say though is that Scottish Water do have a research project that they've funded at the moment, where they're looking in Highlands and Island rural communities at recovering heat from wastewater, and whether that heat recovery could then be used as the power for wastewater treatment, because you need, part of what you use energy for in wastewater treatment is to heat the water so that the bacteria work efficiently, because it needs to be at 30 something degrees, 37 or something. So we lose a lot of heat in wastewater in houses and through washing machines and things. So that heat could be harvested and then used locally, for example, for water treatment. And I know that they do have a project looking at that at the moment. Okay. But it's at R&D
it's at that stage,
level.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And questions from Deputy Convener.
Thanks very much, Convener. Professor Lunn, I wonder, could you clarify what we were discussing earlier in terms of consumption? Your report, which I have in front of me here, kind of suggests that energy consumption in Scotland is dropping. There's been a consistent fall since 2007. I thought I heard a little bit of conversation saying it was going up. Could you just... So
it is currently, that's Scottish Government data. So yes, demand is dropping, but once we move to electrical vehicles, that will absolutely not be the case. Okay. Because you need to, at the moment, transport accounts for 25% of total consumption, so it's about the same energy consumption as our current electricity consumption. Mm-hmm. So it's about 25 each, basically. Mm-hmm. So if you move all of cars over to electricity, you're looking at somewhere around doubling your electricity demand, depending on the efficiency of vehicles and how that compares to current oil and gas efficiency.
Mm-hmm. I can add to that a little bit. There are around 200,000 electric cars currently in the UK, but the estimates are to go to 35 million by 2040. Now, the current peak demand for electricity is 61 gigawatts. If we look and project using those figures, we can have between an increase of 5 and 30 gigawatts. So that's another 50% of electricity needed, and that puts stress on the system, as well as everybody wanting to plug in overnight in order to do it. So one is, where is the electricity going to come from? Is there enough overnight to do that, given the other competitions on the space? And is the grid
actually competent and fit for purpose currently. So those are some of the demand issues that we face. There are some unintended consequences as well. If you think about the batteries that are needed, the raw materials are things like lithium, cobalt, nickel, and the challenges of scaling up to get those particular raw materials is really challenging. There are only a few sites, for instance, for lithium. It's the lithium triangle in South America. And the amount of water needed in order to get the lithium out of the ground is more than hydraulic fracturing in the Permian Basin in the western US. You can mine it in Australia. Congo is the site for cobalt, but it comes with challenges there in terms of child labour and social responsibility and environmental impact. So one of the questions looking ahead is, even if we go over to battery electrical vehicles for transportation, can we do it in terms of the capacity of the electricity system? And secondly, what are the unintended consequences of doing so? Because before you know it, you may have a public rejection because of environmental or social concerns for going for those things, quite apart from the way in which the market will respond in 5-6 years' time to that demand on those raw resources. So there are a number of pathways we can go, but they're not without consequences. I hope that answers the question.
Yep. Professor Lunn again.
I was just going to add one thing to that. So if you look at the current World Bank estimates, just to meet the 2-degree drop in 2-degree reduction in climate, World Bank is estimating that metal production will need to increase by 1,000 times, which is very, very significant.
Okay. I wonder if I could turn to there's a really nice section at the beginning of your report about social acceptability and economic well-being and so on, and there's a lovely description of the 3 key, it's a trilemma, you describe it as a trilemma of decarbonisation, affordability and security of supply, but that's been kind of superseded by a 4th consideration. It's the kind of public acceptability, economic, sustainable and just transition. Could you just tell us a little bit about why you've put that into the report and the significance of that, and how, if you could possibly give us any information, the 2 governments, UK and Scottish governments, see that important part in this transition to a low energy economy?
Gavin, do you want to reply to that?
Well, in terms of the energy quadrilemma, I think what's important to understand is that each aspect of the quadrilemma is interrelated to the other. So it's a very complex dynamic, and it's very difficult to look at one aspect of the quadrilemma in isolation, because if you affect, or if there are changes to one aspect of the quadrilemma, it will almost certainly impact in another area. In terms of the Just Transition, the Scottish Government has obviously moved forward with its Just Transition Commission. The UK Government is rather less developed in its thinking on that. So I think that this is something important that the Scottish Government has initiated, is looking in some detail at ideas around the Just Transition, which is very difficult and controversial. And I think the Scottish Government's Commission has reflected that, the business that it's looked at. It's also the case, I think, that the idea of Just Transition itself is something which is under development at the moment. It's moving from being one which was largely concerned with issues surrounding, for example, workers' rights. Clearly, if you have an energy transition, we've already had one in Scotland in relation to the coal industry. The disappearance of the coal industry obviously had enormous social costs, which weren't articulated particularly well. And looking to the future, one of the ideas inherent in the low carbon transition is that we ought to be able to factor in social justice as an important element of what we're trying to do. And the idea of the just transition is moving beyond simply being about workers' rights and industrial issues, and a much more broad concept of how communities and individuals are affected by what is undoubtedly going to happen in terms of the low carbon transition. And this feeds back into, I think, to the idea of an independent statutory commission looking at all aspects of the energy sector, because one of the key things there is trying to assist governments both in here in Edinburgh and in Westminster too, in terms of negotiating the mediation between the different elements of the energy quadrilemma, and also recognising that this process of transition that we're embarking on is a long-term process. It's going to take decades, but our governance system as it's currently constituted at the moment is inherently short-term. So it operates on 5-year political cycles. And within the design of our governance system, that's something I think that we really do have to address if we're going to be successful in terms of having a just transition in particular.
I mean, you've talked about the varying different technologies and options and possibilities. Where are we, do you think, in the public readiness to embrace any or all of these? I get the sense from previous discussions at the committee that we kind of need to do a little bit more. Both governments need to do a little bit more to get the public to embrace these challenges and to go along with them. They tend to do go along with it when they see the green agenda. They very much sign up to that. But when it comes to actual technologies on the ground and costs of them, when it hits you in the pocket, where are we in that side of the agenda? Do we need to be doing more to bring the public along with us?
So I look back a few decades to the 3-day week and where we were in the 70s. So people then realised that actually things like the North Sea and oil and gas were going to be almost a salvation. And people bought into that because of the struggles and challenges that they had as a result of the 3-day week and so on. We are in a similar situation now, but people generally, I get the sense from many of our conversations as part of the committee work here, it's hard to either articulate or for people to understand the complexity of the energy system and the need. So yes, I absolutely agree with you. If you buy into the green agenda and the climate, the need to ameliorate and address that, then people do understand. But when it comes to a local happenstance of storing hydrogen or carbon dioxide beneath one's feet or building a wind farm just down the road and so on, there are challenges there, and people look at the local scale rather than maybe the broader long-term picture and the gain. So I think there is a real need for education there to educate the public as to what the need and demand is and why this is important for sustainability in the future, to ensure that we don't get power outages and other challenges within the energy sector. So there's a lot of work to be done there in a way that, if I look back, as I said, to the 70s, perhaps people realised the need and bought into it, at least in the short term, because the lights were out.
Mm-hmm. Can you point to examples, perhaps across Europe, where they're ahead of us in this field, and they've managed to persuade the public to accept and embrace the kind of technological changes that we need?
I'll talk about a couple of issues. One is failure. One is the example I used where it hasn't worked was that in Holland, the idea to convert depleted oil and gas fields into carbon storage sites ran ahead of itself without public acceptance, and at a place called Barendrecht there were protests which actually led in the end to the fact that CO2 could not be stored anywhere onshore in Holland as a result of that, because there wasn't the public engagement or understanding of it. A success in the same country is where low enthalpy geothermal has been used to warm a town, Heerlen, where people were taken along with that. And if I use a Scottish example where this might happen, fuel poverty that was mentioned earlier is particularly drastic in areas of former coal mines. To use a soundbite, you could actually turn the old black into the new green, because many of those coal mines are now flooded. Because they're flooded, they've got warmer water, not warm enough to boil a kettle or have a bath or anything, but warm enough to actually put them in a district heating system, a local heating system around radiators and the like with ground sourced heat. If that lifts the heat sufficiently in those deprived areas to take people out of fuel poverty, that they're not so worried about putting money in the meter, allows them to put food on the table or to keep warm enough through a winter, that is something where it's done clearly social and public good. So there are a number of examples where we can draw from Europe and look at the UK and perhaps even turn some of those old coal mines to good effect for geothermal. And geothermal in general is really, we can learn a lot of lessons from Europe again, because where it's been successfully deployed, not just with hot rocks but warm rocks as well, there are opportunities on a local scale. The issue being, can you scale up? And maybe it's horses for courses, different things in different areas depending on the local happenstance that will work. But you mustn't forget the sort of broader, larger aspiration and issues. So there are local solutions and there's the longer term gain.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Andy Whiteman.
Thanks very much. You talked about setting up an independent expert commission. I just want to explore what that might look like. I mean, we have the Committee on Climate Change, we have governments, we have parliaments, we have experts already. You talk about it being an advisory commission. I mean, how would this be a UK body? Would it be a Scottish body? And what difference do you think it would make?
It would be ideal if it was a UK body, as it stands at the moment, because...
Would it not be essential?
I think it would. So we discussed this in the committee, but it's hard, and it would certainly be better. But we all thought there was value, regardless, in having that kind of long-term look across the piece. And I think the value in the independent commission would be having a very broad range of skill sets on a long-term independent body, and those skill sets could include planning, policy, economics, technology, potentially members of the public, legal. So you could have a very broad range of issues, all of which are pertinent, including things like building and infrastructure, which accounts for something like 39% of energy consumption, including its construction. So to have that kind of range across the piece, I don't believe there is anything like that could look at the whole piece and give advice and think about, yes, the relationship with the rest of the UK, and yes, could apply some pressure at least in rest of UK, even if it was not possible to set it up in the UK. But I completely agree with you, it would be much better if it could be a UK body. But I still think, we all still thought there was significant value in Scottish Government having one, not least of which because it allows independent advice and pressure, as well as to UK Government and some pushback, as well as advice around some of the local generating possibilities and the local planning and legal system. I don't want to add. When
we started the inquiry, we discussed long and hard, given the original terms of reference, whether this would be very Scottish-centric. And a number of us argued very strongly that actually you can't look at Scotland's energy future without thinking the UK, and without thinking the UK within its European or global context. To give you an example of that up until the early 2000s, the UK was completely self-sufficient in oil and gas. We're now in a situation where at least 50% of our oil supplies are imported, and gas. So we have to think about it as all joined up. And in that particular instance, it's whether it's LNG, where does that come from and get delivered to? Where are the interconnectors? We rely for 30% of our oil and gas needs from one oil field oil and gas field in Norway, Ormen Lange. And what would happen if that pipeline stopped? There are consequences of that as well. So really important, I think, that it's all joined up. However, to answer your specific question, if we look at Scotland, there is a need, I think, to think about solutions. What I think we did well as a committee was to map the landscape and to record it in this. What we didn't do is to go to the next step of looking for solutions, pathways and consequences. And that's, for me, what I think needs to be done next. And to weigh up, if you go a certain route, what's the impact? And is that the desirable one, or is there a better way to go? And somebody needs to do that piece of work, both on the local scale, but without forgetting the UK and broader dimension.
Can I feed into that as well? From a governance perspective, the situation that we've got in Scotland obviously is that the powers and competencies dealing with energy governance are spread between Holyrood and the UK government and Parliament. But what is, I think, true to say is that the Scottish Government's ambitious plans for low-carbon transition, net zero, and the future depends very much on an effective collaboration with the reserved powers authorities in London. And in that context, it's a very, very complex regulatory and governance dynamic. And its success or failure will, I think, have quite a considerable impact on what actually happens in terms of the low-carbon transition in Scotland, in terms of our energy futures. And I think that one important thing that a Scottish-focused committee could do is take full account of that. Because the design of the regulatory system that we've got, I mean, let's face it, if you were sitting down and designing a regulatory system for Scotland's energy from scratch, you wouldn't design what you've got now. It's come about by constitutional happenstance. Scotland Act 1998, the way it was set up. But if we assume that that is the reality that has to be dealt with from a governance perspective, there is, I think, quite a strong case for saying that there needs to be a Scottish-focused commission that keeps all the devolved and reserved issues in play, because to drop the ball on one side of the fence, if you like, will result in failure at the end of the day.
Okay, that's helpful. I suppose, I mean, I don't demur from the fact this may be quite useful, but government's not got a good habit of paying any attention to commissions. So we mentioned, energy efficiency. We have the Energy Performance Building Directive of the EU, which mandates nearly net zero by December 2020. We had the Sullivan Report in 2007 that recommended net zero for new build by 2016-17. We had building regs published 2 months ago, the 2019 building regs, that contain no change at all in CO2 reduction targets over 2017. So this is an intentionally political issue. And the Chair, Rebecca, you I think mentioned members of the public. I mean, what's been quite interesting in a number of European countries recently has been the role that citizens' assemblies and deliberative methods like that have played, because this is a long-term solution. Everyone's going to have to change their behaviour, their buying habits, their outlook, their perspectives and all the rest of it. So is there not a role for more imaginative ways of planning this future than a kind of expert commission, the members of which I'm sure would be extremely well qualified and all the rest of it, but at the end of the day, the government's just very easy just to ignore, because this is difficult.
I think you're right to be wary of yet another official body, but I would say that it's important if in deliberations such as, for example, citizens' assemblies, and also in the formulation of government policy and government thinking, that there is authoritative, evidence-led research available for people to work with. And I think that's something that a commission of this sort could do, because there is the danger of going down blind avenues and ultimately of failing in terms of low-carbon transition. And it's not to say that a statutory commission would be the only game in town, and clearly, as you say, and if you look at countries like Denmark, for example, community and citizen involvement has been absolutely crucial in terms of taking forward low-carbon transition and developing the energy sector. But there is a need for far more evidence, authoritative evidence, to inform policy making right across the energy sector. And if you look at the bodies that are in existence at the moment, if we take the Committee on Climate Change, that obviously does good work in a range of different areas in relation to energy, but it's focused primarily on climate change. Similarly, when the National Audit Office comes in and does something on energy, it's a sort of snapshot of particular budgetary issues within the energy field. The Competition and Markets Authority, when it gets involved, it's looking at competition aspects. There's a lack of a holistic whole systems approach to analysing what's happening with energy. And given the interconnected nature of different aspects of the energy quadrilemma, I think that's a gap in the regulatory structure, the governance structure that we've got. And to go back to your point about the findings of committees can and are regularly ignored, that is absolutely true. But nonetheless, those findings, it's important that they're out there, that they're made. And it's also the case, I think, if you look at something like the Committee on Climate Change, that does have a very much more authoritative weight behind it. And that is, of course, in large part because it's a statutory body. It has a degree of permanence, it has a degree of independence that the normal political advisory committee, which is perhaps even time limited as the Just Transition Commission was initially, they have a far limited, more limited ability, I think, to influence debate over the long term. And so those were some of the ideas that we had in terms of underpinning the idea of a statutory commission.
Okay, just a couple of other questions. What are we going to do when Hunterston and Torness come offline?
You tell us.
Building wind farms.
So, can I just make one comment on the... So, there will be we will import across the border from England, basically, and we will import nuclear if it comes online. So, I mean, that's inevitable, I think. So, but one thing I would say is as we build, yes, we will increase renewable production, but you're still trying to meet the gap, not double production in doing that, which is what we need to do. And I think one thing we haven't talked about is the way we commission renewables either. So I was recently at a meeting looking at offshore wind, floating offshore wind generation, and the design lives for those renewables were 25 to 30 years. That's not good enough. By the time we hit our net zero carbon, they'll be going offline just about. So, you know, we need to be thinking in a wholly different way, not buying the cheapest thing that can be manufactured in China or whatever, but thinking about a form of offshore, for example, renewable production where it's modular, recyclable, it can be part of a circular economy so that you can build it in such a way you can recommission parts. So this is a long-term solution, not a 25-year solution. So it needs that kind of long-term thinking, or in 25 years' time we're going to be in exactly the same position with our renewables fleet going offline. And we also, if we're looking at 1,000 times more metal production just to meet the Paris Agreement, we can't then do it again to build another set of renewables. So we need to be thinking in a very different way about how we do this. And if we're ahead of the game, and you know, this is all very doom and gloom, but that's not the way people are thinking. If we're ahead of the game in thinking about this as a future, then we can export those technologies. So, you know, and think about bringing taxes in to fund some of this, not just solving Scotland's problem. If we think about it differently, we can make a business out of this, I believe. And I do think, although there'll be some people that wouldn't invest in that, much of Europe would invest, I'm sure, in things that were renewable and recommissionable and used recycled components and just thought differently about a long-term renewable solution.
And the elephant in the room, of course, is the North Sea and the oil and gas reserves that sit in neighbouring waters and in the West Shetlands. But if they're going to be used to make up the shortfall, then that demands, in terms of climate amelioration, that carbon storage works, and to ensure that that's done safely and in the right sites. But current estimates are that over 90% of the remaining reserves of oil lie in Scottish waters, and over 60% of the gas. Is that going to be left in the ground or used to help make up the shortfall that you describe, so that there's less need to import from the south or further afield? But in order to do so, the carbon storage needs to go alongside, and of course that's a largely untried, untested technology yes, and expensive in the North Sea. But the first exploration well for a CO2 storage site is currently being drilled in Norway, the Aurora well, for the Northern Lights project. And the question would be, can we do something similar and in fact repurpose many of the depleted oil and gas fields for that, while still producing oil and gas safely and sustainably, which may make up the shortfall.
Yes, I mean, you mentioned in your report that research suggests that in order to have at least a 50% chance of meeting even the 2 degrees centigrade goal, globally, a third of all oil reserves, half of gas reserves, and over 80% of coal will need to remain unused. Now, the Scottish Government's response to a challenge like that is to say, well, you know, if we did that, we would just import it. Is that a cop-out? I'm going to answer that in a slightly different way, and I'll come back to the point that one of the things that we're seeing is that the energy supply and demand is being driven largely by population growth. And if we look at projections ahead to 2040, 2050, whether we like it or not, oil, gas, and indeed coal in the Far East are still very much part of the equation. So there is still exploration going on. There are oil and gas reserves. We may be able to import that if we don't use it at home, and even effectively export our carbon as a result, in the way that Germany and other countries have done as well. The question is whether there is going to be sufficient supply of new reserves to meet even that demand, and that's why China and the Far East are looking at coal and still developing that at a pace now, because they're trying to alleviate their own needs and demands in energy. And if you look at the UN sustainability goals, one of those is clean energy, another one is fuel poverty. And so they're pointing at those particular tasks and saying, well, actually, that gives us the mandate to go after coal, oil and gas in order to do so. But if we really are serious about the climate and carbon emissions, we have to do something to address that in terms of carbon storage or similar technologies. And whether we can do that at the scale that's needed and the pace and finance demanded is a real challenge. Okay, I've got a technical question and one more substantive question. On the substantive question, I understand that there's proposals to build an interconnector with Norway on electricity. The bigger question is, how important is it going to be for the UK to stay part of the emerging EU energy market in order to provide a kind of smart grid at that scale?
Okay, I'm not 100% sure on the actual market arrangement that will happen if it's not part of that. They're reasonably straightforward if it remains within the emerging European market. Generally, there are ways of arranging it so that you get bilateral trading. My understanding is that most of the interconnectors are merchant-based, i.e. somebody takes a bet on it and Ofgem generally regulates the prices. The question really there is to what's driving that is the extent to which prices diverge, and will they diverge? And certainly that's one of the things that European markets are doing, is trying to dampen that. Something like that I think actually be quite valuable to Scotland if it goes ahead. To a large extent, it means you can generate more renewables. The excess can get exported either south or across to Norway, and then you import it back. So it's about that almost a distributed storage on a very large scale. So I think that I'm reasonably in favour of that, but I think the interconnected capacities are not sufficiently large to rely on wholeheartedly, although you can put a degree of reliance on. But you need stuff based here. And I'm less pessimistic about the need. I think you can do an awful lot with renewables. Certainly the Committee on Climate Change thinks that you can do a great deal with them, but not absolutely everything. And so I think it's an area where there is a competitive advantage here in terms of the resources. What needs to follow it are the jobs and the infrastructure for manufacturing, as well as just the operations and maintenance. There's a lot of skills here. I'm not too worried about 25-year lifetimes for a wind farm. It means end of 25 years you can place it with something bigger and more efficient. because that's the way the technology is going.
Okay.
I have one concern that I just want to share with you, and like looking into a crystal ball and whatever happens in terms of European Union future. In Holland, the Groningen field is about to be decommissioned, and they're going to leave 50% of their gas needs in the ground in Holland, largely as a result of earthquakes and ground subsidence and the loss of public acceptance that getting the gas out of the ground from an onshore gas field as large as that is acceptable anymore. That has a consequence that Holland now needs to import its gas from somewhere else, from Russia or wherever. And if that demand is such, and we are at the end of the line in the UK, what is the implication of being out with Europe if we need the gas at a certain time? So yes, having other interconnectors to Norway and so on are important and essential, I would say, but there may be impacts that we have not even predicted, let alone ones that are coming along the road that we know about and have not done anything about yet in terms of Groningen.
Okay, and finally, just one little sort of daft laddie question. I mean, reading page 39 in your report, paragraph 23, it says that in 2017 the UK imported 151,891 kiloton of oil equivalent of energy. For reference, final consumption of energy of that year was 149,139 kiloton oil equivalent. Can you explain that? So in other words, we're importing 151,000, and we're consuming 149, but presumably we're also generating quite a bit. Is there an export figure there that's missing to balance that all out?
Certainly the amount of production of energy in Britain is quite high. I think what's happening there is we export different things to we import.
Yes.
So I think that's probably it. But also there's an awful lot of energy gets consumed in the processing of energy into different products. We would have to look at that. I think
okay, if you could come back on that one, just for my interest, but I don't understand why we're importing more than we consume. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll just leave that.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jackie Bailey.
Some of my questions have already been covered, but I think it's worth just focusing again on the oil and gas sector, which Professor Underhill raised first of all. It strikes me that there are many in this Parliament that would argue that it's not really compatible to have full economic recovery in terms of oil and gas extraction alongside declaring a climate emergency and wanting to have carbon reduction. So I'm clear that what you're saying is that wasn't the view you presented. You think oil and gas is critical in closing the energy gap that we're going to experience, provided that carbon capture and storage offsets that. Would that be a fair summary of your position?
It certainly is, and the way that we've looked at it is the low carbon energy transition rather than going off a cliff, and how one manages that. And so the oil and gas that we need needs to be balanced with the carbon emissions and the targets, and we can't do one without the other. But equally, we can't do without the oil and gas if we're going to continue to have the energy supply and the quality of life that we've been having. And that basically is the challenge. It's an uncomfortable conversation for many people to have, but it is an honest one. And I think that's really where we need to engage with the public and have a social license to operate if we're going to do so, but do it with open eyes and connect with everybody so that they understand why this is important, because there are consequences of not doing that in terms of the energy supply in Scotland.
What timescale would you envisage for having that review if people were to be engaged in looking at the changing policy landscape and what it means for them? How quickly do we need to do this?
I think we need to do it very quickly, because the impacts of this are going to be lasting. You know, in the next 5-10 years, we have got to make a difference. So I think in answer to an earlier question, that you can set up a commission that may not be listened to, but importantly, if one sets up something that's statutory in this way, we get an energy policy of meaning for the long term, and we should set shorter term timescales on this to report. So it isn't a talking shop, it actually is going to report out and give the full suite of options that people can look at, engage with, and perhaps appreciate that there are difficult decisions ahead and challenges for our lifestyle and in the choices that we make in energy supply.
Okay. Would you envisage the Commission, or indeed any other body, looking at, the cost of what you would describe as offshoring oil and gas for both jobs, the economy, and indeed for carbon emissions?
Absolutely.
As well as this whole idea of a just transition for oil and gas workers, which matters enormously to the economy of the North East.
Yes, and I absolutely agree with everything that you've said there. And just to extend that a little bit more and to underline a point that Becky made, Scotland has the opportunity to be leading here and to be exporting those skills and techniques and technologies across the world to other countries that have a burgeoning oil and gas business, but will be facing the same questions and social responsibility and worldwide responsibility. So I see an opportunity here for the North East and Scotland in general to develop the skills and techniques and to export them for good.
Okay.
Can I just add to that as well and say that there's a potential also, I think, for Scotland to blaze a trail in terms of developing ideas around governance of the energy transition. And I think that would be appropriate if we look at the legislation the Scottish Parliament has passed on climate change, on net zero, and the way that not just the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament has engaged with the work of the Committee on Climate Change. I think that viewed from a global perspective, Scotland is already ahead of the curve in terms of thinking of the issue of governance and how it can deliver the low carbon transition. And I think as we move to this next phase where we're thinking about heating and transport, the opportunity is there for Scotland to lead in that area as well.
Okay. Thank you very much. Can I move on to energy efficiency and demand reduction, something the convener raised at the very start? Has any assessment been made of the costs of energy efficiency and demand reduction programmes as opposed to just increasing generation?
Not by us.
Not by us, no.
No, there is a lot of work going on at the moment, and the Committee on Climate Change have done a good bit of work on this. The number of academic groups as well as BEIS. It does cost somebody, but actually it saves. So the vast majority, I think, of certainly the early stage, the low-hanging fruit, saves you money. Yeah. And it's only really at the extreme end where it really starts to cost you something. Okay. So I think it's something that we didn't look at explicitly, but there's plenty of information there.
Yeah. But obviously, in terms of convincing people as well, that potentially is something we would want government to do, is that cost-benefit analysis of the different options that are there. Okay. What about local authorities? They currently have a role in terms of some of the energy efficiency schemes that are currently running. What role do you think they play in delivering net zero emissions, and do you think they have the capacity and resources to do so?
I'll answer the last bit first. No.
Okay. I think I knew the answer to that, but
yeah, I knew
expert opinion.
So, no, I think the role for them is, and it's right across the UK, the expectations on local authorities are very, very high. There are a number of organisations, particularly the energy systems, Catapult, which can help in helping them master plan local energy plans. But you do need people on the other side who are trained and have the ability and the capacity to actually act on them, as well as the money to implement them. Okay. So I think there is the expectation that under-resourced councils can deliver something that's critical is not credible.
And I think to add to that is the granularity that in each of the local councils they're going to have different problems. We heard from the Highland and Islands before. You can think about conurbations. They've all got different challenges, and so the local authority we're looking after, quite rightly, it's local population. But actually, this is much bigger and needs to be joined up.
I just add something on the financial side. I think whether it's local authorities, well, you'll know more about local authorities than me, but I suspect whether it's local authorities or individuals, finding financial ways of spreading the capital costs is probably the only thing that's going to make this feasible moving forwards. So most people can't afford a large capital sum to change their home or their, and I think the same will go for very big infrastructure projects to a degree around making those sort of making big changes to existing council infrastructure, for example, that trying to spread the costs of this is something that's going to happen, thinking of financial systems.
I mean, that is actually a feature of the sort of emerging energy supplies. You're moving from something which is very, very much dependent on paying as you burn to something which is investing in capital to save or produce.
Yeah.
So it lends itself very well to a much more mortgage style approach, which I think, given how lower borrowing rates are, maybe that's not a bad idea.
And the interesting thing from my perspective is I think local authorities and housing associations have done actually very well in terms of their own stock, whether it's new builds or retrofitting, but a whole empty canvas exists where it's owner-occupiers or indeed businesses. Do you think there is a need for us to require owner-occupiers to do something, or indeed require businesses to do something, and who bears the cost?
Well, I think there will be a need. If we're to hit the net zero carbon, I think it's impossible to think that there won't be a need. Who bears the cost and how it's done, I think, depends on governance. So,
one of the attractive things about going for hydrogen as a heating fuel is that you don't then need much change in the way that people heat the homes. The downside of that is you don't need much change in the way they heat the homes. So I mean, I do think people need to take action. I'm guilty of not taking appropriate action in my own home. I would, and probably should, have already insulated it completely to the rafters. It's mostly the rafters that are insulated. But you may need to go down the mandation, but it tends to be, you probably don't want to try that first. You want to try the encouragement, the guilt, all the stuff that normally works.
But I think that not worked for you, and this is your
No, it hasn't worked for me. No,
expertise.
I'm just waiting for my 7-year-old to start telling me about it. That's coming soon. So no, so I think mandation helps, and I think one place you can get owner occupiers is if they want to extend their properties. Planning, building regulations.
Or indeed at the point of sale?
Indeed, yes. And certainly that's a thing for rental accommodation.
but again, spreading the cost
Yeah.
against the reduction in energy bills would make a big difference to individuals, I think, which is not what currently happens. And then if you sell your house, there are issues. You need to find ways that you can sell that on somehow, I think, to make it a viable thing for people to do.
Yeah. Thank you.
So,
Thank you, Convener.
Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener. I want to look at the issue of security of supply. And in your report, you said in page 28, para 49, the UK as a whole is unable to supply its own requirements for heat and power from indigenous sources and has an increasing reliance on importing gas and electricity. So can you maybe say a wee bit more? I know you spoke to Andy about the interconnectors, but can you say a wee bit more about the importance of the interconnectors? And the Crown Estate report that came out recently was suggesting that by 2025 the amount of electricity certainly that was going to come via these interconnectors was going to treble. So you see maybe a wee bit more about the dependency of the UK on the interconnectors.
So 10 years ago you had relatively low interconnection to the continent, one interconnector to Ireland. Now you've got 3 or 4 to the continent and 2 to Ireland. So the volume of interconnection's gone up. Now the interesting bit about these is that they are direct current links. Essentially they allow you to operate the UK system, the Irish system and the European system doing their own thing, but essentially trading when they need to. Certainly I think the important bit about interconnectors under normal circumstances, they allow you to get rid of surpluses and cope with imports. Where it's interesting and where it becomes challenging is the extent to which you can rely on those at critical points, so peak winters or problems. And to a large extent, we've not seen too many examples of where we have hit critical points and the interconnectors actually providing that security. So some people will argue that they are very secure. Technically, they are. But when you have market coupling, sometimes it doesn't automatically work the way you would imagine so, which means expensive price, you ought to get exports and imports into your area. So it provides a degree of reliance. I wouldn't say that you would bank on it wholeheartedly, but I think it adds something. It's another diverse source. So you tend to find that when you get low wind speeds in Britain, you tend to get lower wind speeds on the continent as well. So you may have the same problem.
The last time I visited National Grid down at Reading, they were suggesting that it was between 3 and 5% of the UK's electricity requirements came from these, and they were a net importer of electricity. Yes, would that be right?
Yeah. I think that's right, yes. Right.
And it's the idea of building a new one, but what's recently come on my radar is the slight upsurge in public opinion against having a one built through Hampshire through Portsmouth, which wasn't the case in the other interconnectors, wasn't even on people's consciousness. But I can see a situation where people are now questioning whether interconnectors should even be built and where they should run, which may lead to opposition in the future, although, as you quite rightly are hinting at, it's a crucial element in the energy mix. So there may be opposition in those areas that we haven't seen before that are going to challenge us.
And given, sorry.
I was just going to add to that we need to bear in mind that the whole, with electrification coming online, the whole electricity demand profile is going to change, yes. Yeah. And because it's not just us that require more electricity with electrification, it's all of Europe. It's not clear to me, at least, that it's something that you could rely upon to meet missing production. It's clearly a better way of storing surplus, and there are clear advantages in energy efficiency to having the connectors, when it's not true that it's less windy and that we have none, and rest of bits of other parts of Europe have significant excess. There are some clear advantages, but I don't think it's something that's clear that you could rely on because we can't produce enough in total.
And you go on to, in page 29, to say that Brexit could also potentially cause disruption for cross-border UK-EU energy governance, policy making, regulation, enforcement and funding. So, I mean, what impact would that have on these interconnectors that we're so dependent on at the moment, if that was to be the case?
I think obviously we need to wait and see exactly what type of Brexit emerges, but I think that what we had in mind in that section was really to point up the fact that if we are no longer part of the EU, then we no longer have access to the same level of financial support from the European Investment Bank in terms of developing projects of common interest, such as interconnectors. So the financing of that sort of infrastructure could well become more challenging. It may not, but it could. So I think those were the sort of concerns that we were trying to outline there. I think in many ways key aspects of the energy system will be relatively untouched by Brexit. I mean, I think that when people are switching on the light switches, the lights will still come on. What it may do, though, is suck out investment for future developments, and that, of course, has potentially a very significant knock-on effect further down the line. So, initially, impact of Brexit, probably not very significant, but 10, 20 years down the line, we may find that we've not been able to develop things in the way that we would have, because we haven't had access to the same sort of political dynamic, but also financial resources.
Okay. And looking at Scotland's position, if I understand the profiling of Scotland's energy needs, you know, it's roughly 25% electricity, 25% transport, 50% heat. Now, if we assume, rightly or wrongly, that 50% of heat is going to be met by hydrogen or something like that, then we need to focus on the transport and electricity. We're electrifying our railways, we've got the targets to get more electric vehicles. You know, can you say something about what Scotland's installed capacity for electricity is and what our peak demand currently is? I know it will grow with the more demand, but where are we at the moment in terms of installed capacity and peak demand?
Gareth?
The numbers, they're definitely in there. I think the peak capacity is about 5 gigawatts. So, but the installed capacity is far in excess of that. But you do have to remember that a large lump of that is wind. So the demand will go up with electric vehicles. If you do it right and you encourage people to charge at the right times rather than at 5 o'clock when they come home, and certainly the smart charging is a critical part of that. And a lot of the assumptions that National Grid and the others make is based on that actually working. There's good suggestions that will work. So I think the electric vehicle side of it is something which is I think is coming. Certainly the availability of them now is far better than it was even 2 or 3 years ago. So I would expect the number to go up, quite whether it's up to 30 gigawatts on a UK basis or much lower than that with the smart charging, but it will go up. But the counter to that is that you will get better air quality and you will get better overall energy use.
But you have to bear in mind that our production will go down when the 2 nuclear power stations go offline.
Indeed.
Significantly.
What proportion of our renewable installed capacity is nuclear? Because numbers I've got is our installed capacity is 11.3 gigawatts and our peak demand is 5.3. So there's a bit of headroom there, albeit things are going to grow. But what proportion of that is nuclear?
It's about 2 gigawatts of that is nuclear.
Right.
But that's base load.
With Hunterston going off now, that's down a bit. Peterhead adds at the moment about 800 megawatts. Yeah. So it's actually, we're quite light in some respects on the large generation. But if you actually look at the direction of travel for electricity, it is away from very large centralised plant towards smaller stuff. Now the issue there is the extent to which wind farms and that combined with storage and smart control and demand response can replace that. I'm reasonably positive it can go a very long way. Others are more pessimistic.
Is there anything we can do in order to encourage more domestic generating capacity in Scotland? I'm thinking, for instance, contracts for difference. Is there anything that has to be done to change that would encourage more investment?
I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the feed-in tariff had an enormous impact in terms of sort of solar PV. What didn't help was the constant fiddling with it and the digression. So actually the thing that you want is a stable climate for it. Certainly I feel having removing solar and wind from the contracts, onshore wind from the contracts for difference is unhelpful, because they are, to a large extent, your cheapest form of energy. Whether domestically it's a little bit more expensive, but the large-scale solar, large-scale onshore wind are cheap, and we should be encouraging them.
Right.
I'd like to answer part of your question in terms of gas and the security of that supply. So at the moment, 75% of our gas needs to make up the shortfall. We have about 45% indigenous gas. So of the remainder, 75% of that comes from Norway. About 10% in combination comes from Holland or from Belgium, and I've mentioned about the challenge in Holland already. Belgium, I can't help but notice, doesn't have any oil and gas. So we import it from Belgium, but actually where does it come from? Russia. And 40% of European Union imports in 2017, most recent figures available, 40% of gas comes from Russia along that line. So we are sort of security dependent in that regard. Of the liquid natural gas imports that we have, which make up the remainder, so the remaining 15% of our imports, it's something of the order of 85%, 85% comes from one country, Qatar. And the remainder comes from places like Algeria and elsewhere where there are LNG ports. Now, I can't help but notice again, Qatar is having its own issues in the Middle East, and Algeria isn't necessarily the most secure form of supply. So again, thinking about the energy mix and gas and how much we rely on gas for our domestic heating and other uses, there are real challenges there again. And in March 2013, I'm sure most of you are aware, but we, as a country, became within 5 hours of running out of gas. There was a particularly severe cold spell, cold snap. Brighton Beach froze over, and if we had not had an LNG delivery to Milford Haven, we would have lost the domestic gas supplies. That's how close we got. Now, it's not coincidental that within days of that happening, shale gas came on the radar, because people started to talk about, crikey, where are we going to get this gas if it's not going to be imported and we can't rely upon it? And people looked across the Atlantic at the States and thought, we've got shale in this country, this will work. The issue here, however, is that the geology isn't with us for that, whether it's in Lancashire and the fault networks that generate earthquakes when one drills, or the very fact that the country has been uplifted, geologically speaking, so that the coal mines are at the surface. The shale was mined in the Midland Valley. In the States, the shale gas that has been successfully produced is at its depth of burial where the temperature is sufficient that it's effectively generating today. It's a source rock today. Whereas many of the sites that are considered to be, by some perspective in this country, are shallow and exposed and not at that depth. They are not overpressured and they're highly fractured. So the question is, if that is the case and shale gas cannot be a secure supply of gas, what now? There has to be a plan B or plan C, and given the figures that I've just read out to you about where we're dependent upon, gas supply, given how important it is for Scotland, for the UK, we need to be thinking very nimbly and carefully about where we get those resources.
And is there any evidence that the UK government is looking at this issue seriously to try and address this?
I think the general feeling was that if it worked, this is for shale gas across in the States, that if it worked there, it could work here. The geology is the same, isn't it? Well, actually it isn't. There may be relatively small areas in the UK where all the ingredients work for shale gas, but they appear to be in places like the East Midlands, not actually in Lancashire where the drilling has so far taken place, and not in Scotland. So I don't see the technical assessment being done that underpins the work that then informs policy. And actually it's more seems to be being done because it works over there, so it must work here. If it doesn't work here, we need to be asking those questions now. What are other sources? And that is quite independent of the social acceptance of going after a resource like that, of which there is very little appetite, I would say.
And just my final question, and it's similar in lines to what you've just said about gas. We had the last time this committee looked at the energy system a few years ago, there was an issue about Black Start, and we've obviously had the issue south of the border where just over 1 million people lost their electricity supply. Now, my understanding at the time was that our hydro stations would restart the system by kicking in Longannet, which in turn would kick in the nuclear power stations, and we would be up and running within about 12 hours, 8 to 12 hours, something like that. What's changed, or what's changing, and is there still an issue with Black Start that's not been addressed?
It's being addressed, but you don't have it yet. So there is quite a lot of work going on with the two transmission operators, the the ESO supply, let's say the National Grid in England, to address this. And it is basically you're having to replace the positive things about large thermal generators with something else. So the issues there are the ability to cope with rapid fluctuations in demand as you bring things online, the ability to energise very high power infrastructure. So you've got lots of voltage control challenges there as you go along. And that sequenced approach, it's designed completely differently. So it's on its way. It's not here yet. But I think there is money budgeted in the through the new transmission licensing arrangements to allow that to go ahead. But it's not cheap at all.
Right. And with that,
but it's essential.
Will that allow electricity systems to be back up and running as quickly as the previous system, or will it take a matter of days rather than a matter of hours?
That I'm not sure about. My understanding, they wanted to try and get it towards 3 days rather than 7. Right. But ideally, you don't want it to go off. Yeah, that's your issue.
Right. Okay. Thanks so much.
Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Neil. As has rightly been mentioned, a great part of the issues around energy are actually in the hands of the UK government. And one of the worries which, just like to highlight at the beginning, is that the Energy Transition Readiness Index shows that the UK is 8th out of 9 countries, which is not very hopeful for the future, frankly. But I'd like to touch then on new technologies and the uncertainties around new technologies. And a very simple question: who should take the lead in developing and putting in place these new technologies that we need? Who should be responsible?
Good question. At the moment, in particular, we're talking about generation technologies here, are we? So, I mean, the recent history has been that the private sector takes on development. It's generally the public sector that provides the initial investment and the ideas. Certainly a lot of university work has spun out, but it's generally the private sector that drives it through. Government has a role, I think, in providing an environment in which it is possible to bring through new technologies, in providing a stable regulation, providing appropriate funding at the right points in the development cycle. Some parts of that have not gone brilliantly in the last few years, but the underlying development capacity is there. There's an awful lot of capacity available to do that. What's interesting, though, is often that the overseas institutions and companies often steal a march on us at some point. We saw that with wind. It's not yet happened with tidal. It may, but the responsibility is a mixture between the private sector and the government, I think. But the government ought to be taking a reasonable lead in providing an environment which development is possible.
Is the scenario that you're describing there, the division of, shall we call it, responsibilities, isn't it a historic one? Is it appropriate for the future? Because that seems to me to be what's always been.
Yeah.
Whereas we're moving into new scenarios now. Can the private sector actually shoulder the costs that you're talking about? And can the public sector actually raise the money to fund what it needs to?
I think that's a very, very important issue. And what we've had since the privatisation of the electricity and gas industries in the 1980s and 1990s, we've seen the state step back essentially from taking key decisions. The state is, I suppose, in some ways quite understandably, reluctant to take the decision as to which horse to back, because in some respects the state has a pretty patchy record in terms of backing winners, in terms of new technologies. But the privatised energy system that we've got, the marketised energy system that we've got, wasn't designed with the idea of a low-carbon transition in mind. It was designed to operate essentially in a fossil fuel-based sector. And so I think myself that there is a greater role for the state in taking key strategic decisions on technologies and being quite upfront about saying this might not work. We may lose money on this, but the overall objective, which is of a successful low-carbon transition and contributing to climate change mitigation, is so important that we have to take that on the chin. So I personally would argue that we're now at a time and a space where state should be stepping up rather more than it has done in the past in terms of steering the direction, setting the channels down which private finance and enterprise can operate, and the big energy companies can then do the running on.
Just carrying down examples where this might have happened, a couple of false starts actually in the CO2 storage sector. I can remember back probably now 15, 20 years that the Miller project was proposed, whereby CO2 would be stored in the Miller field offshore and enhance oil recovery whilst also offsetting carbon targets. And I remember being at an all-party parliamentary group of Earth Sciences down in Westminster, where Greenpeace said this was a great idea, BP said it was a great idea, the British Geological Survey said it was a great idea, and it was rejected, primarily because politicians didn't want to be seen to support the oil industry at that time. So we had that opportunity. What was it, 3-4 years ago? The GoldenEye project was cancelled when there was a state-funded £1 billion scheme whereby Shell would hand over a depleted gas field with a view to the St Fergus Peterhead and St Fergus terminal being used to export CO2 into the ground. When the British government cancelled that, the Shell left the arena. So it's a company-state cooperation where the state has a really important role to play. Now, what I'm really noticing is that there is what I think many of the oil and gas companies consider is there's an existential crisis over their future. And they realise that they need to be investing in R&D, in new technologies in this area, and indeed they are. So a company like Total now have pledged 10% of their R&D budget annually into clean energy. So have Shell, Equinor, formerly Statoil, now changed their name, BP, are going back into these alternative energies, and they see themselves as energy companies rather than oil and gas companies, because their future is also at stake. And I think the investment houses are also asking very difficult questions and holding the companies' feet to the fire and saying, what are you doing in this arena for the new technologies for clean energy? So we're actually seeing much of the change that you're alluding to already taking place within companies in the R&D. It's not necessarily well publicised, but it's beginning to happen. But with the state and industry together, and public opinion and investor appetite being what it is, that's a very powerful conflation of forces.
Looking at I just wanted to add in that question on a smaller scale as well, that there are a lot of examples, particularly around the renewables sector, where IP has been developed in Scotland and it has been lost offshore. And I think that is because of a lack of investment, basically, to keep it here. And opportunities to grow a business, to grow the economy around renewables and to export have been lost. And my feeling is that as we move forward, if that's allowed to happen again, energy will always end up being a net cost. And we need to invest in the IP we develop here and manufacture, and not just think that skills are things that we export. We actually have to think about technologies that we export and manufacturing that we export.
Actually, these comments lead me to the next part of this question, which is, by the very nature of the challenges we're facing, a lot of the technologies are what you might call emergent technologies. You don't really know where they're going. Should projects in these emergent technologies be kept alive in the hopes of future breakthroughs and maybe benefits arising from them? And who funds it?
I would say that they should be, and that government needs to at least take a part in funding that. We don't have a big sort of culture of hedge fund type activity here as they do in the US, which might make it a bit easier. And sort of big, huge private investors. But my feeling is that if we don't invest in these technologies, then we lose all opportunity in terms of any economic gains that can be made for this. So there are a couple of examples that came up recently at a meeting where one was around remanufacturing, so recycling and remanufacturing of fibre composites from wind turbines, where there's a small startup that is struggling for investment, yet clearly that has to happen in the future. We can't keep having a disposable economy. There's another one, there was another example that was given around ferrous, replacement of rare earth metals with ferrous alternatives. That is the future. We can't, and rare earth metals, the clue is in the name. We cannot keep relying on rare earth metals. So they are rare and they're extremely environmentally damaging to produce. So the idea that we would, and that technology is already looking like moving out to China because it can't get investment here. And I mean, that's a huge, huge future market. Even if they can't sell it just now, that is clearly the future. So we need to make some investment decisions, yes.
And there have been moves in this direction on the UK level that up until maybe 5 years ago, a lot of the big research funds that were coming out were more to do with climate change and just documenting climate change. But there's been a change in emphasis, whereby now UKRI, so that's the UK Research and Innovation, the former Research Councils UK, have come together under one umbrella, and they're trying to tackle global challenges. So there's the Global Challenge Research Fund, there's the National Productivity Investment Fund, and what do they align with? The industrial strategy, so the clean energy strategy. So there has been a move in that direction. Has it been enough? Has it been fast enough? I would argue no. And as a result, some of the emerging technologies still wither and die rather than being supported in the medium to long term. But I think that emphasis changing over to look at tackling the challenges and the problems and finding solutions to those rather than just simply describing that climate is changing, I think is really, really important to do. In Scotland, I would argue the Scottish Funding Council and the pooling initiative that they've been running, and Louise Heathwaite has done a superb review of that and reported out in the summer. Her recommendation is looking forward that it should be challenge-led, theme-led, for the universities to look at exactly these issues and be getting central funds from the Scottish Funding Council as well as the UK government through UKRI to tackle that. And I would hope that that would be the case.
I just add to that I think there's still a gap though. So I think with UKRI type funding, you can get to, I presume you're aware of technology readiness levels, so from fundamental through to near market 1 to 9. And with UKRI money, yes, you can get to TRL readiness levels of 8, 9, but you can't start a business on it. And the two examples that I was talking about are people that have got right through to developing product, and then they need business investment, and they're looking offshore for it. And that, for me, just means we spend all that money developing that IP here and investing in it, and then we just let it go, and as somebody else has taken it and is now going to make the profit out of it because we don't invest in that last manufacturing step, basically, and building the business at a decent scale. And we continually do that. That's my feeling. I
absolutely agree with that, and I think the role for Innovate UK and Scottish Enterprise in this space is really, really important, and I'm not sure that that is weaved into the narrative currently.
Yes, I think that we have to think in terms of a sort of culture shift in the way that we approach this. If we think about areas like health or defence, these are areas where it's recognised that the state has a leading role in decision taking. And I think we now have to think of energy in that context as well, because of the imperative of low carbon transition in order to mitigate climate change. And where we are at the moment, in the context of our privatised energy system, we're not accustomed to thinking in that way. And I think that one of the things we do have to address is a shift in our thinking.
Coming back.
I'm conscious of And also that Mr. Lyle is yet to be given an opportunity to ask questions. I'm not sure if perhaps one last question to wrap up what you want to ask about Mr. Beattie, and then we'll come to Mr. Lyle.
Just perhaps leads into a bigger thing, but just a small question. Everything does. But are existing distribution networks able to handle the current level of connections from small-scale renewables?
No. If you look at the heat maps from Scottish Power and SSE, you will see that vast tracts of Scotland are full as far as smaller scale renewables are. You can fit them in here and there, but the bigger stuff is a challenge. Some of that is the distribution networks itself. Some of that, in fact, the majority of that is actually transmission. And the issue there is the export capacity south. So there are issues here about the ability to use renewables. Certainly when there's a lot all at once, you struggle with it. Now, part of that is about the way that the networks are designed and operated, and the sort of procedures that are used to say this is enough, this is too much. That's changing a bit, so I think we'll free up more capacity. The more that you put more control systems, active network management into those as a matter of course, the more you get in. The other part of it is about, ironically, consuming more locally in the right places at the right time. So that's where things like electric vehicles, potentially heat, particularly with conversion of electricity into hydrogen, can start to basically consume when there's more than you need, and do the opposite when you've got too little. So, but there is a genuine issue there, and certainly with the tendency for the regulator to try and keep costs low, that invariably means that the networks aren't actually expanding enough. That's their trade-off. They feel that you can do more with controls than copper. Generally use aluminium now, but you can do an awful lot if you actually strategically invest in the larger scales. Certainly the business plan from Scottish and Southern that went in does talk about reasonably substantial increases in capacity north to south, driven by the demand for renewable connections. But the distribution networks are still a challenge.
Come on now to Richard Lyle.
Yeah, it's been quite interesting. I've been jotting down quite a lot of questions, but I'll reduce them slightly. Times have changed. 70s and 80s, councils were modernising houses and changed them all into gas. I'll need to think about changing from gas back to electricity. But be honest, electricity was so expensive then, you know, and that's why everybody went into gas. When we need to now get smarter and develop more projects, and it was interesting the point you were putting, when wind turbines were first being developed, most people were sceptics. Now they're a success. There actually is, I'm suggesting, I've been pushing for years for car charging points to be installed in new homes. When we're building a house, we should put them in, no retrofit them. Wind turbines actually should be attached to houses. Same as solar panels, more clarity in the price and the development of solar panels, but also wind turbines. If you actually go to a street off Saracen Street in Glasgow, there are wind turbines attached to houses. A project that was then disallowed because planning permission was changed in the UK and in Scotland, and the firm who were doing it went out of business. But that firm has now developed a new project, and here is my question. They've developed a new project, but they can't get funding. And this is what is the most annoying thing. We have people out there, entrepreneurs, who have great things. We now have to develop more projects to meet demand. And I remember also as a councillor that Scottish Power used to export quite a lot of their power to England. Don't do it so much now. But basically, would you agree that there are answers out there who are not being supported with funding? And I know of one of them. I'm not going to name them, but I know of one of them. But I've asked for a meeting with Scottish Enterprise to see if they'll come up with the funding. And is that what really annoys people? There are projects, but they can't get funding.
So I would agree that there are technologies out there that would definitely reduce demand by local production, that there is currently no market driver for, which is, I think, what part of the issue is. So there is partly the problem of getting those technologies funded as a business, and there is also the issue of whether there is a driver in terms of new developments to, if it's not the cheapest development for a council, for example, or for a developer to make, and it's going to be a bit more expensive to buy that house, then there's a question then about whether the people will actually develop it. So I think there are two problems. One is around the actual development market for that, in terms of incentivising more efficient houses that both produce, store as well, and reduce demand. And you didn't talk about ground source heat pumps, but they're definitely something that are made significant use of in Scandinavia that we do not make use of and could really reduce our demand. But at the moment, there just isn't a market to push doing it. So I think, yes, there are two issues. There's around business development itself with new technologies, but there is also regulatory or financial incentive type drivers to make these things desirable to construct, and I think that at the moment they're completely lacking.
I think to answer your specific question, the answer is yes. The funding is a issue, and Scottish Enterprise and maybe other organisations perhaps need to bring energy up their agenda, because it's not there at the moment.
I hope they're listening.
Yeah, and I think the point that Gavin made before about other areas, defence and so on, have this statutory body and an energy policy which is long-term that allows you to experiment and try things that may fail, but there is investment in that. Energy seems to be sort of left out of the discussion, and yet, as I hope the report does, it shows that this is the current landscape. Which direction we're going to go is obviously challenging, but whichever direction we go, there needs to be investment in this area, and it all needs to be joined up, and energy just seems to be left out, and yet it is so fundamental, especially looking forward.
Yeah, I would agree with you, that basically my mother-in-law was Dutch, and basically we went to some schemes in Holland that were quite innovative. If you go to Denmark, Sweden, all different places where, heat, your waste to heat plants. But can I say I also had an application in my constituency for a waste to heat plant that everybody opposed because of the health concerns. And really, do we really need to now have a national conversation about waste to heat and how it can work? How is it in other countries people say, oh, that's fantastic. And yet in Scotland we go, no, or as they say in Glasgow, no, we don't want it.
So I think the answer is yes to the national conversation, and it's not only around waste to heat, but all aspects of energy and how it affects our lifestyle.
Thanks very much.
Pick up very quickly on that. I mean, you picked up on a lot of what you described in terms of essentially mandating new builds. And if you actually look at the profit margins of your typical house builder, a mass house builder maybe costs £100,000 to put up a 3 or 4 bedroom house, but they sell it for, in some places, 600,000–700,000. So there's some profit in there, and okay, some of that's land.
I'd love to go to the houses that you buy.
Now, 2-bed semi in South Edinburgh is £500,000. There we are.
Okay.
So it's that sort of, but that's this is a national. It's a national
they say
issue.
It costs £5,000 to install a car charging point. So really, if they can put in a telephone line, if they can put in a satellite line, if they can put in a broadband line, they can put in a car charging point. Surely.
Yeah, I think it should be at scale. It's cheap because they're putting in the electrical infrastructure, and that's where you take the opportunities to buy the stuff, do the stuff at scale, and do it properly.
I really like your idea about wind turbines in every house or solar. Depending on the local happenstance, let's build something that's fit for purpose using the things that are working in our favour in that area. And that might be ground source heating. If you're over an old depleted coal mine that's flooded, it may mean if you're on a south-facing slope, it's solar or whatever. But let's have that conversation and build it into the regulation.
To finish, convener, I'll send you I could actually physically send you the prospectus of this company's. The government already have it, and I'm waiting for an answer.
Can I just...
I was just very quickly I was just very quickly going to say that
If you want to briefly make some closing or final comments, then please do.
I was just
Professor
going to
Long.
briefly say that if we make government-led decisions and regulatory type decisions around these things, then the cost of technologies will also drop once they become scaled, once they scale up, and that's really clear from looking at solar, for example, which has come down significantly. So I think making sort of strategic decisions also makes a big difference to the costs. So.
All right. Well, thank you very much to all of our guests for coming in today. I'll suspend the meeting. We'll move into private session now. Thank you.